The world as you know it is over, and humanity has been pushed to the brink of extinction as monsters known as origami have begun to ravage, destroy, and consume everything. To combat these ferocious creatures, weapons crafted from the same cells as the origami are created as the only things capable of slaying these beasts. Although humanity has become able to finally fight back, not everyone is capable of wielding these new weapons, and those few who can pass a series of tests are able to pick one up and not only fight to protect humanity, but fight to protect the future of humanity. These individuals are deemed God Eaters, and their weapons, the God Art, as they themselves are seemingly now the only defense in defying the cruel fate God has placed on the world. On the surface, many will look at this game as just the anime version of Monster Hunter, and although this comparison isn't without its truth, the series is much more than this. The date is February 4th, 2010, 5 years after the PSP's initial release date. Japan has just gotten a new exclusive game for the platform titled God Eater from the developers over at Shift, who, at this time, were responsible for the puzzle game series Devil Dice and Bombastic, as well as the party games Ape Escape Academy 1 and 2, and the traditional RPG, Ape Quest. Up until this point, Shift had been solely focused on puzzle and party games, so when looking at the rest of their catalog of titles, God Eater was something completely new and stood out amongst the rest of their games. In fact, God Eater was released into a genre that was dominated solely by the founder of said genre, which is the game series Monster Hunter. At this time, Capcom had already released, not counting re-releases or expansions, about 4 separate titles into the Monster Hunter series, so it was clear that this wasn't just a one-and-done craze for the genre. It had fans and staying power, so releasing a new take on the genre would definitely shake things up. God Eater, in contrast to Monster Hunter, was grittier, much more story-focused, provided an entirely different aesthetic to its characters and world, and overall provided a new feel to the genre. With all of this and being the second ever game to release into the genre that wasn't Monster Hunter, it was bound to catch the attention of the public. And based on its reception, I'd say it did pretty well, as the original God Eater was released in Japan to decent reviews and it sold over 610,000 copies, 295,000 of those being in its first week of release. Shift had seen the success of God Eater, which was actually outperforming their original hit in Devil Dice in its first week, which sold about 815,000 copies. With this success, God Eater eventually received a re-release in God Eater Burst, the version that was also released overseas, and the version that I got to play when I was younger. Burst was a newer and updated version of the game that featured more content, more gameplay adjustments, and new gameplay mechanics. This version sold about 263,150 copies in its first week in Japan, and in combination with its original version, sold over 1 million copies in Japan alone. From here, God Eater had gotten a full sequel in God Eater 2, which also got its own expansion in God Eater 2 Rage Burst. God Eater 2 was received really well and was considered a worthy sequel to the original game, as it essentially took the original game, added a huge amount of content, new systems and mechanics, as well as a new story that continues off the original with new stakes and new characters. When digging around forums, it seems the God Eater community recognizes God Eater 2 Rage Burst as one of the better entries into the series, especially since it has hundreds of hours of gameplay, including episodes that give extra insight into the characters and a bit of extra development for them. Gameplay wise, God Eater 2 Rage Burst was just more of what people loved about the first game with just more. Then after God Eater 2 and Rage Burst, a full remaster and content update to the original game was released, and became the definitive way to experience the original game, and is considered to be the best game of the series by many in the community. God Eater at this point had proven itself to be a staple series in the monster hunting genre, and it created a large collection of fans for the series. But when it came to God Eater 3 though, Bandai Namco, the game's publisher, wanted this next title to be something different, a shake-up to the series if you will. So they handed this new God Eater sequel to another developer, while Shift would go on to develop Code Vein. Marvelous Incorporated was tasked with creating God Eater 3, and although I find it to be my personal favorite of the series, many longtime God Eater fans felt very divided on the title for a plethora of reasons. Some didn't like the new story, how easy the game had felt compared to previous titles, the balancing of certain weapons and playstyles, or even the slow pacing of the game's difficulty curve. For many, it took several steps forward in many departments, but it also taken several steps back as well. Think of God Eater 3 as the Monster Hunter world for some Monster Hunter Hunter fan diehards. Although the most divisive of the series, God Eater 3 had reviews similar to that of the original game, but it didn't quite do as well in units sold as previous titles. The sales numbers weren't horrendous, but they surely didn't hold a candle to the numbers of the previous entries, especially when you begin to compare the game's numbers to the latest Monster Hunter releases. Yikes. And you may be asking, if Monster Hunter, the founder of the Monster Hunter genre, is doing numbers like this, why bother with God Eater? Well, God Eater provides quite a different experience to that of Monster Hunter. God Eater, in my opinion, has a much more detailed and interesting story and world, more interesting characters, and gameplay that, although reminiscent of Monster Hunter, keeps itself distinct enough to be both unique and familiar. Monster Hunter has had a reputation for having little to no story in its games, until later entries which personally created a fairly forgettable and lackluster story. Monster Hunter has been solely about providing solid gameplay, and the story has always taken a back seat to this. Not to say that there haven't been great moments in set pieces though. God Eater, although also having solid gameplay, just didn't let its story take the back seat. You and your custom character are given a story and a purpose, and are able to grow connections with the characters around you. Each game has told great stories to varying degrees, with characters that to this day I still think about. The story of God Eater is interesting, not just because of the creatures hunting humanity, but because of the character dynamics and interaction, the lore of the world, and even the story beats of the different games that have actually made me feel emotions that Monster Hunter never could. These characters you fight alongside have their own goals, aspirations, backstories, and even secrets in the case of some. Now, one of my favorite things that God Eater does is show how cruel this new world you're in is. Here are just a few examples. Civilians are not allowed into the protection of government cities until they or a family member pass a test to become a God Eater, and those who are let in have their DNA logged into a database. So if there is ever an opening to join the force and you are called, you are required to step up. And if these options aren't in your cards, good luck out there in the slums or the wastelands while this thing is roaming about. God Eaters are also treated differently depending on the port or caravan they work for. Some are treated like actual human beings, are paid and housed, while others are treated like tools and are kept in cages. Some of the newer God Eaters even have their armlets designed to be clasped together like handcuffs. The game also doesn't shy away from reminding you that death is now a commonality in the new world. Even the test to become a God Eater has a chance to kill you. Oh, and these armlets God Eaters wear are literally the only thing keeping them from being devoured by their own weapon, which, as I mentioned before, is made of the same cells of the origami monsters. This weapon is alive, and without these armlets, which constantly deliver a dosage of a bias factor, would consume its user. This armlet is also permanently fused to your body. Even if you retire or leave the force, you will still have this armlet on your person. Even looking at some of the designs of the origami is enough to make you wonder how you could stand up against such terrifying beasts that are literally born to just consume and kill. Some of these designs are even uncanny, some looking as if they were gods. It's not just size in these monster designs that are made to make you feel like death is knocking on your door if you were to encounter them. I remember as a kid when playing God Eater Burst, there was my first time hearing the alert that a Vajra had invaded in on my early missions. Seeing this thing just eating in a corner, for it to then turn and start fighting me while I tried to kill my other targets was genuinely exhilarating for me then, especially since I was at the time, just like my character, inexperienced. God Eater isn't just about hunting monsters, it's about protecting and saving humanity. It just so happens that your job is to fight them. And with the story, sometimes your greatest enemy isn't the monsters. Now, when it comes to the actual gameplay of God Eater, it can vary between the Shift era and the Marvelous Inc. era of the series, as God Eater 3 was much faster than the previous titles, but the gameplay loop remained relatively intact. God Eater, in comparison to Monster Hunter, is a much different experience, but aside from its aesthetic and story, they have a somewhat similar gameplay loop. It is just hunting monsters at the end of the day. You'll even be using the materials you get from hunting to upgrade your equipment and craft new gear. The differences in gameplay, though, begin to show themselves in how you go about doing these things. Both games have a selection of weapons that change your moveset and overall playstyle, but God Eater changes things up by having your weapon have both a melee and ranged mode, which also has its own categories of weapon types and bullet types with the ability to even customize bullet attributes. We even have other skills and techniques, depending on the game, that enhance your play, most of which are tied to the game's devouring mechanic. God Eater is overall a much faster paced game than Monster Hunter, as you get in close for melee strikes, rolling out of harm's way to barrage your enemy in bullet fire, knocking them to get a devour and activate your burst skills, or risking a hit to try and sneak in a devour while they're still active. No matter what weapon you choose, because of the design of the game, you are able to be a threat from any distance at any time. And with the game's universal shield mechanic, which also could be customized, you were able to be in the fray for longer no matter your build. Monster Hunter has taken steps to make combat faster with the wire bug system in Rise and the clutch claw in World, but even this doesn't hold a candle to what God Eater is capable of. God Eater 3 has so many systems in play in the later stages of the game, in acceleration triggers, the engage system, burst starts and burst plugins. On top of the new air dash mechanic, the gameplay is flashy, fast, and has many layers of customizability. The previous entries in God Eater Resurrection and Rage Burst are fast, but nothing close to God Eater 3, which dials things up several notches. Monster Hunter does just outright do some things better than God Eater though, and one of those is map design. Monster Hunter has more interactability with the environment, added verticality to the map and its areas, and even a wider variety of locations. God Eater maps are more focused on having you fight in ruins of civilization, which although makes sense for the story, the variety in these areas feels not too great. I also really like how Monster Hunter allows you to visit these locations and expeditions without having you to take on a specific mission. All monsters that are native to that location are available during said expedition, and you can explore the map to your heart's content. God Eater has no expedition system, and instead has everything tied to missions. Whether side quest or main quest missions, they are all replayable, so you are able to go in and grind certain monsters if you need to. Monster Hunter, with the aid of the interactability of the environments, also has more intricate combat, as you're able to slide, mount, and swing onto the monster. There's also more prep work for each hunt, making you more involved in the hunt from the moment you decide you're going after a specific monster. I also do enjoy the plethora of items at your disposal during your hunt, rather than just your main weapon. God Eater does utilize items such as traps, temporary stat buffs, flash grenades, and etc., but not to the degree of Monster Hunter. And again, with Monster Hunter's larger and more detailed maps, there's the process of actually tracking the monster, whereas in God Eater, you'll know where to find your target pretty much all the time. Overall, God Eater statistically holds a little competition to the juggernaut that is Monster Hunter, but that doesn't mean God Eater isn't worth your time. A comparison I'd make is God Eater is to Monster Hunter as Digimon is to Pokemon. There will be those who prefer one over the other, or even like both, but there is clearly a larger fan base for one. God Eater is a fantastic series that does many things Monster Hunter just doesn't, and provides an experience that many hold near and dear to them, including myself. I can't recommend these games enough, and if they interest you at all, their latest versions go on sale quite often on Steam and the PlayStation Store, and God Eater Resurrection is actually bundled in with God Eater 2 Rage Burst, a solid 2-for-1 deal. I hope you enjoyed today's video, and I'm sorry this one took so long to get out. I've reworked this script so many times, and I've got a lot going on behind the scenes, but new content is on the way. So, if you want to know when new videos are coming, or just want to support the channel, consider subscribing and ringing the bell. We're so close to 300 subscribers. And as usual, my name is CrossVee, and I hope to see you all next time. Love y'all. Peace.